Thank you for the invitation to speak. I feel, slightly weirdly kind of nervous about this. I feel like for the last 15 years, I give talks to old ladies in museums and exhibitions rather than talking to experts on subjects. And I was thinking last night how it feels like an awful long time since I did research on Barbara Hepworth. So as the show we did together was less than 5 years ago, I probably shouldn't say that out loud. But a lot of the research actually for that show was done by Inga Fraser, so we should name check her as well as her contribution. So when I was asked if there was anything I wanted to talk about, I couldn't really think of anything. And then I thought there's a sort of interesting body of late work by Hepworth where she uses sort of radically different kind of stones, is what particularly came to my mind, which I thought no one's really sort of paid attention to. And then actually, again, just in the last few days, as I sort of paid attention to it, I realised that Matthew Gwen and I talked about it a bit in the book we did in 2000, and actually it was a feature in the centenary exhibition, the St Ives bit of the centenary exhibition, which I curated. So I'm sorry, I was going to say I'm sorry if I'm repeating what other people have said, but I'm sorry if I might be repeating what I've said myself and forgotten. So sorry about that. Okay, now let me just get on top of the PowerPoint, just the arrow. I know, I should, yeah. Just to make the point that, the material that is synonymous, I think, with Hepworth in particular is white marble. It runs through her career from the certainly from the 1930s right through to the very end, the very last sculpture. That was drawn out actually in the centenary shows where the final room of the St Ives exhibition was it was called, I think, Interrelated Masses, and had works from the 30s and the 50s, but all about white marble pieces in some sort of three-dimensional relationship. And then the Yorkshire Sculpture Park section of that centenary celebration included a large group of the later white marble. So you see the white marble running through her career, and certainly in the 60s it became very much one of the prominent parts of the way people wrote about her and talked about her. There were a series of interviews, people, including Paul Hodin, going to interview her in the garden and commenting on the relationship between the Cornish climate, the white marble, and a sort of Mediterranean sensibility. And then famously, some of her last works, her very last works, Fallen Images, they're showing here Assembly of Sea Forms from California, were a sort of conglomeration of pieces of white marble. So it's very much sort of, a lot of her work, I think, depends on the monochrome quality, as well as marble, of course. She also uses dark wood, and in particular in the 30s, her work seems to rely on that sort of monochrome nature because it seems to be so particularly about that interrelation of masses, very much about how two or three solid objects relate spatially to each other. So it's about volume and mass and space. And I think even with those single forms, and there was a white marble version of those, which was lost, she seems to be using the monochrome to sort of throw our attention more on the kind of spatial qualities than on the material and the pattern. There's an absence of pattern, I suppose, in a lot of the works that we think of. And yet in the last years, the last decade of her life, I suppose, you see her really kind of reveling in this sort of new, particularly new stones, and seems to be sort of seeking out the ones with the most kind of incident, the most surface pattern. And I think, though, the interrelation of masses and volume and space remains a kind of ongoing concern, there is also a kind of celebration in surface patterning, which seems very different to her early work. You see it here in Two Rocks. It's a wonderful sculpture. And you see also this amazing diversification of materials. So having worked for most of her career with quite a small range of woods and stones, white marble and a few indigenous stones, you suddenly see a huge range of different materials. So here on the left is serpentine. I don't know if serpentine marble the same as serpentine, conservators amongst us. I always thought serpentine was green. Anyway, that's how it's listed. And then this sort of pink, the Portuguese pink marble piece is pinker than it looks in that slide. And this amazing Swedish marble, which as you can see, this is one of the earlier sort of uses of these sort of new, much more sort of stratified pattern stones, where she sort of then articulated by painting those surfaces. Always seems a really strange thing to do, to paint a stone sculpture, but it was something she'd done in the 40s repeatedly. And it almost like she's sort of throwing attention onto the surface and of these areas of these sculptures, as if sort of defying the kind of the monochrome quality of the material. I mean, obviously they're not perfectly monochrome. The piece on the right is Hopton wood stone, so it does have a sort of granular, varied quality, but nothing like those later stones. So in a sense, that use of paint is going back to this earlier moment where for sort of 3 or 4 years she was applying paint to stone carvings. And they obviously were coming out of the wooden pieces that she'd started in the 1940s, and this is the first of the wood carvings she made, having not carved for a couple of years during the Second World War, where she's developing this sort of key theme of her work, which is about the internal space of the block. So having made works where it's the sort of space between masses, this is now sort of opening up a space within the mass of the sculpture. And I guess this is the first time, in a way, the surface starts becoming a really kind of key element in what the sculpture's about. The way she, if you think about what this sculpture would look like if she didn't paint any of it, she kind of helped. One of the things that creates that sense of a space, a hollow space within a sort of outer crust, if you like, rather than a block that's been drilled through, is the way she paints the inside, as it were, and leaves the outside as bare wood. I can't remember what's coming next now. The first sort of move in the 60s into a sort of more diversified kind of range of stones comes with her use of slate, which I was told, one of the really interesting things that Matthew Gale and I did when we were cataloguing the Tate's collection of Hepworths was interview all the surviving assistants. It was a very bizarre experience because they were all in very sort of different circumstances. Some were working artists, and one guy was sort of in a hospital bed in his front room, and it was about 95 degrees. We sort of, we couldn't think what to say because it was so hot. But one of the stories we learned from that, and how accurate this is, I've never been able to check, that we didn't have as much sort of, as full access to the archive at that time as we do now, was that her first slate pieces were made when the assistant salvaged an old billiard table that had been thrown out from the billiards club in St Ives, just down the road from the studio. I don't know whether that's true, but it is true that a lot of these slate elements are about the same sort of thickness, kind of, I don't know, 1.5 inches, I think. Conversely, I was told, we talked to Henry Gilbert, who was a local architect and a friend of Hepworth's, who I think claimed that he had introduced her to slate. He certainly introduced her to the Delabole slate, he said. He had used it for flooring in some of his buildings. And he encouraged her to use the sort of the slate from deeper in the quarry, which is much blacker. And that's the quality you see here. And she obviously sort of embraces and celebrates the kind of intense blackness of the slate once it's polished. And one of the things I think these pieces drew out was her sort of pragmatism and the sort of economy of means, that these are actually very simply made. The slate you can sort of cut with a saw and then fairly easily round off the edges. The assistants termed that pebbling, because you turn something which is hard-edged into something which looks like it's been sort of weather-worn. And often the work at the bottom, which is very small, they said would have been made using the corners that have been cut off when making a larger piece. So if you think of those sort of large slate pieces which have sort of rounded tops, the triangles would have been the first pieces to be sort of sawn off to start making a more organic shape. And you see in this piece how she then uses the blackness of the slate and the whiteness of the marble to create contrast. And I think one of the interesting things about this piece, which from here is completely invisible, is that she uses 2 different white marbles. So the kind of small white marble element in the middle is much purer white, more like the marble she used in the 30s for than the large sort of bowl form, which has a sort of grey patterning in it, which shows, I think, how conscious she is of the contrast between the different sort of materiality of the stones that she's working with. And that fits in then with this sort of phenomenon. You see a whole series of works from about 1965, I think, where she starts using lots of different marbles. I think there's a lot of correspondence, others can correct me if I'm wrong, with more than one quarry in Ireland, where in Connemara, for example, where some of these green and grey marbles come from. And you can see how she uses them. She comes back to this idea of sort of two forms in spatial tension, but uses the different materials and the different surface qualities, I think, to amplify that sort of sense of tension. But, oh, right, okay. I wasn't expecting that. So, yes, she does that several times, using different stones. But then also you see her with single pieces, and it almost looks like she's seeking out stones which have as much variation in them as possible. So this is Ancaster Stone, the same stone actually that is in hieroglyph in Leeds City Art Gallery that Laura showed. And this is touchstone. Annoyingly, this official view doesn't show that around the other side of this, there's an amazing speckling of white pieces, which is a sort of shell form in the marble. And the correspondence shows that she asked the quarry to send her pieces with as much shelly patterning as possible. So it's really interesting that she's very obviously, explicitly seeking something which isn't plain and monochrome in the way that she had preferred in her earlier life. And obviously this sort of echoes changes in other materials. So you see, while she continues with making bronze, she also starts working with aluminium. I think this might be upstairs, is it? And clearly painting the surfaces. So this sort of colouring of the surface is, again, throwing as much attention onto the qualities of surface and finish as on the sort of spatial and volumetric qualities. And I think her, in a way, this is sort of first seen in this, what seems always used to seem to me quite sort of counterintuitive use of really polished bronze. I used to think these were awful. I kind of quite like them now. Where the sort of reflectiveness of the surface, I think, amplifies the importance of surface over mass in a way quite different to the original carvings. And it's interesting that you see in several instances her developing the two ideas in parallel. So this is shaft and circle, and the bronze follows almost immediately upon the stone carving. And then that sort of, the impact of different materials on a single idea is really striking. I mean, it's amazing, I think, the transition she made from that sort of truth to materials doctrine. And I think Hepworth, more than other artists, particularly Henry Moore, found it hard to abandon those early principles. But you see her kind of, this is a stone carving from 1935, which she had the presence of mind to cast in plaster before it went to New York that year, and then cast it in aluminium. I have to say, the aluminium's dated 1935 as well. I've always been deeply sceptical that it was pre-war, but I have absolutely no evidence to justify redating it. And then she casts it in badly in Cornwall. There's a nice anecdote about the casting of the first bronze version. The foundry in St Just used to throw old taps into the mix. And all the chrome would melt off, and the assistants, as they sort of ground down the surface to polish it and take off they keep breaking their rasps because they'd hit a little bubble of chrome in the surface. And you can see there, I think, there's lots of dots where they've had to fill in those holes left by the chrome nuggets. And then it's completely transformed, I think, when in its sort of raw, polished form. So that's it. I think the idea there was simply a sort of, but really fundamental shift, I think, from an emphasis on mass, volume, and space to something which is also about surface that you see in the patterning of stones and the reflectiveness of metal. Thank you. Sorry, it was more than a minute.